Hello, welcome to the Science Set Free podcast with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Now, Rupert, I know you've been reading a new book by Nick Spencer called Atheists, The Origin of the Species, and this has kind of lessons for us almost, I think. It does tell the history of atheism, but also tells us something about what we've called the atheist experiment and what we can, as it were, learn from that for, you know, what it means to be human and so on. But what did you find in the book? Well, how have you found the book?
Well, part of it is the history of atheism, and that I found very interesting because we're all aware of contemporary atheists. But one of the things that came across in the book was how much it's depended on national politics. The history of atheism in France and England and Germany and the US is quite different, for example. And one of the things that I think he makes very clear is that it's largely come about as a reaction against what people experience as the oppressive power of churches or other religious institutions. And in France, atheism was particularly extreme because in the 17th and 18th century, the Roman Catholic Church was strongly allied to a highly autocratic monarchy. And the entire thing held together, the monarchy and the church. They supported each other. So if you wanted to overthrow that particularly oppressive regime, it wasn't just a matter of being anti-clerical. You had to be against the entire system. And being an atheist was a very good way of doing it because it really removed any legitimacy from the system. It depended on the church, and if there's no God, then the church itself had no legitimacy. So from the point of view of a revolutionary agenda, atheism, or at least deism, the belief that there's a God who started things off but thereafter does nothing, and therefore there's no point in having religion or praying to such a God, atheism and deism became an enormously powerful force in France, and based on a very, very emotional reaction, which expressed itself in the French Revolution and the destruction of churches, the execution of priests, as well as monarchs and aristocrats. In Russia, it had a similar history, that the Tsarist, the repressive Tsarist regime, was closely allied with the Russian Orthodox Church. And again, atheists there became extremely polarized against the system. And it was not so much to do with intellectual arguments about science or the details of arguments for God or creeds. It was a way of rejecting a system. Now, in England, it was less extreme because we'd had a Protestant Reformation, and lots of mainstream churches, like the Church of England and Methodist churches and stuff, were all against the Roman Catholic Church anyway. So it was no use just going on about the Inquisition and the iniquity of the Roman Church, because lots of people who were Christians agreed with that. So, in a sense, it led to a much less polarized and much less militant kind of atheism in England. And in the United States, where there was a separation of church and state and a great many different churches, and if you didn't like one, you could just join another, the atheist movement hardly got going at all, which is why, until recently, there were so few explicit atheists in the US. That, to me, was one of the most interesting things. It has a lot more to do with politics and a sense of oppression and liberation from oppression than it does from actual arguments or even experiences.
Yeah, and running in parallel with that, I found very interesting the idea how different countries or cultures have different kind of intellectual atmospheres or environments. So again, in France, where there's a tradition of building great systems from beginning, middle and end, and trying to build a system based on atheistic foundations really sort of took off. Whereas in this country, in Britain, it was actually British scepticism and being wary of systems. In actually, figures like David Hume are often regarded as atheists now. But their very scepticism was as sceptical about atheist system building as it is about Christian system building.
Yes.
And so there isn't the kind of, again, this sort of funny mix of intellect and emotion and political feeling.
Yes.
To get things going, to such a degree anyway.
Yes.
The US story made a lot of sense to me once as well. I remember asking someone when I was in the US once why it is that America is such an advanced capitalist culture, but still very religious too. And they said, well, what you have to remember is that when people arrived in America, they had under their arm the Bible. And the Bible was always a symbol of freedom because they were fleeing particularly European religious persecution. And so it's always got the connotations of freedom and Christianity or religion generally in the US, unlike in Europe where it had this association with being oppressed.
Exactly, and in the US also for black people trying to become free of being slaves. The Bible and its message, particularly in the Old Testament, the journey of the chosen people out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land, there was this sense of that story being a story of liberation and freedom, not just for the white settlers, but also for the black slaves, and even today for black people. I mean, there's a very strong emphasis on that Old Testament aspect of the story, which we have much less emphasis on here in Europe.
Yeah, yeah. And it brings the story right up to date, doesn't it? So that even the last chapter even talks about the demise of our most recent wave of prominent atheism, the new atheism, and points out that, well, he argues that, and I think this is convincing, that there was always a contradiction at the heart of the new atheism, which was, on the one hand, saying human beings are just like other animals. In Richard Dawkins' famous phrase, you know, we're just the lumbering robots that carry around our genes. But on the other hand, saying, but human beings can somehow rise above this animal state. You know, we alone can flee the tyranny of the selfish gene. But of course, those two things are sort of incompatible. And the rhetoric of we can escape our animal nature without reference to anything transcendent and so on, just you know, unravels itself. And he argues that's kind of what's happened in the last 5 years, perhaps, since the height of the new atheism.
Yes, and also there's been a kind of critique of it from within the atheist movement. I mean, John Gray, for example, who is a very penetrating philosopher and I think a very clear writer, himself an atheist. He's not a militant atheist, and he's probably the most severe critic of the new atheism, because he sees what they're doing is really taking over kind of Christian ideas about humanity and human liberation and so forth, for which there's no warrant in atheism at all. So they've got a kind of Christianity light.
Yeah.
With secular humanism, in many ways, its ethical system is a kind of diluted Christian ethics. I think it's done a lot of good. I mean, secular humanism arguably achieved more than churches did in terms of establishing equality of rights and, you know, gay rights and liberation of minorities and overcoming racism and that kind of thing. It's a very powerful liberating force, but essentially it's taking what was a Christian message about human equality and human value and secularizing it and making it into a political movement. But as Gray points out, the basis in atheism, there's no basis in atheism for that per se. I mean, the Marquis de Sade and some of the more cynical French atheists, and indeed Nietzsche, point out that, you know, if the struggle for life is just about a struggle for life and power, then might is right. Nature favours the strong. There's nothing in nature that sets up national health services for sick animals. I mean, sick animals just die. Weak animals just get eaten or even destroyed by their own parents. I mean, there's a ruthlessness in the natural world which in modern human societies is tempered by a Christian morality or a religious morality in general, or secular humanism, which takes these same values, but without any supernatural basis or any religious basis. And Gray's argument, and I think Spencer's argument, is that this is a temporary phase, and atheism left to its own devices would not actually be able to sustain that kind of social morality.
Yeah, it's very interesting because John Gray himself has a book out right about now called The Soul of the Marionette, in which he, in his way. He kind of does again, something which is more common, I think, on the continent in Europe, which is a kind of fearless atheism that, in a way, follows the logic of its own argument. And Gray particularly argues that what we need as atheists is a kind of what he calls a negative capability, borrowing from Keats's phrase, just the capacity to exist in a world where there aren't foundations, where there aren't certainties, and to be able to live tolerating that. But it's quite a big ask. He recognises very clearly in the book it's not actually that many people, it is not actually something that many people, when push comes to shove, are actually capable of. He's a very interesting figure. He feels to me like an atheist who's actually trying to come up with what you might call a sort of a negative spirituality that somehow can cope with the full ramifications of the atheist worldview.
Yes. To what extent it can be successful, we don't know. I mean, a much more popular kind of atheism and another kind of movement going on is the Alain de Botton type, which is trying to reinvent religion for atheists. And of course that happened in the 19th century too, with Saint-Simon and Comte in France, because they were trying to create a kind of atheist religion. And that's what Alain de Botton's trying to do now, recognising that people actually need more than a kind of rather arid worldview in which our minds are nothing but our brains. We live in a universe with no purpose. So, in a sense, that's much more likely to be popular than the kind of thing Gray's looking for.
Yeah, and even, I think even another project quite similar to that is the Sunday Assembly. These groups of, they don't like to call themselves atheists, interestingly, although I think many atheists go along, but other people who are a bit disillusioned with church-going go along too. And the idea there is, again, to use ritual, to use celebration, to use good works. And what particularly interests me about that is that they're also trying to introduce all this within what you might call a gift economy, that, unlike Alain de Botton's experiments, which you typically have to pay for to go to, this is something which, like church, you just walk through the door, and they encourage a kind of gift-giving to support it. And that's very interesting to me, because it does seem to be that sort of altruistic feel does seem to be the beginnings of a kind of spirituality, because it practices, you might say, the notion that what we receive is best when we give it away again, which of course is a bit of a Christian idea,
yes.
That everything's a gift from God and we offer back to God that which we've been given. But doing it in this context, and they talk about actually a humanist spirituality. Sanderson Jones, one of the founders of the Church Assembly, talks about having an experience of this kind of flow of life, which he appreciates going through him, and that it's a kind of gift that he needs to give back. And in fact, I've heard him talk with a couple of Church of England vicars, and they came away thinking, is this really so different at all? Now, that I don't want to sort of suddenly say the Church Assembly are really sort of, theists in disguise, but I suppose what it does point to is a kind of common human spirit that underpins all these things, that maybe in our times we're getting more in touch with that direct experience, and so a bit of free of the kind of baggage of doctrinal creedal statements, which they're put together for the best of reasons to try and discern and hold these things, but can get in the way, I think, too.
Yes, I suppose for a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious, or who think of themselves as agnostic or even atheist, it's not very often based on a close study of Christianity or other religions. It seems to be mainly based on a kind of, partly indifference, partly ignorance, in some cases an emotional rejection based on their own personal bad experiences, but very often not. Very often just part of a kind of default cultural norm here in Europe that educated people are just assumed to be atheists or not go to church. I mean, that's sort of been built into the educational system, that it's the standard assumption. And I think for many people that is a kind of barrier, and it means they have a prejudice against religion in general and Christianity in particular.
Well, that's another thing which he picks up in the book, which Nick Spencer picks up in the book, where he talks about the origins of recent atheism, and in particular pointing out that science originally wasn't conceived of as in opposition to Christianity. In fact, a Christian kind of underpinning was necessary really for early science to get going, which you read about particularly in the Renaissance figure Francis Bacon, who, after the desacralisation of the world is there, as it were, left for our investigation. And he argued that it's because God has ordered the world and given us the intellectual equipment to investigate the world around us. This was a necessary move to make science seem like a good and honourable and worthwhile thing to commit your life to. Then there's this kind of shift, particularly in the 19th century, when science and religion are seen to be at loggerheads, largely for political reasons, reasons of moral indignation, I think he argues as well.
Yes.
But I wonder how you feel, where you feel we're at in this story now, because this is something which, you obviously have a lot of direct engagement with it now. The idea that science and religion are somehow antithetical to each other. Do you think that's shifting once more?
Well, the thing is that the practice of science, the investigation of nature through the experimental method, is not inherently anti-religious. In fact, as you say, the two started off together. And the idea that there are universal laws of nature was derived from various theological and philosophical systems. I think what's happened is, since the materialist philosophy became the default orthodoxy of science in the 19th century, that does create a problem, because materialism is inherently atheistic, at least most of its usual interpretations. This is something we've discussed in some of our previous dialogues, that if you have a worldview that says there's no purpose in nature, the whole of matter's unconscious, the mind's nothing but the activity of the brain, evolution has no purpose or direction, evolutionary creativity is just a matter of blind chance, that does create a worldview which is hostile to almost any kind of religion. And insofar as people identify that worldview with science, then there is a conflict. But as I show in my book, The Science Delusion, Science Set Free in the US, this materialist worldview is not science, it's a belief system which has taken over science. And it's quite conceivable that the sciences can move on beyond it. In fact, they're already moving on beyond it. It was established really between the 17th and the 19th century. Modern science has burst out of this dogmatic straitjacket already, but the dogmas still continue. So I think when we realise that actually we've moved beyond this framework, when we recognise that the nature of consciousness is not simply explained in terms of the brain, that evolution is not simply a matter of blind mutations and the cosmic evolutionary process, if we assume it's purposeless, then that's simply an assumption. We don't know that. It's not proved by science. It's simply assumed by the materialist philosophy.
Yeah.
Then delinking science from materialism, or as science moves beyond materialist dogma, then I think we enter this much more interesting area, which is the area that you and I have been discussing now in a whole series of these podcasts, the new situation we find ourselves in.
Funny enough, I think there was a bit of a sense of that this morning. On the day in which we speak, there's been a partial eclipse of the sun in the UK, and it was cloudy in the south of England this morning, and there was a nice sense of this twilight for about 20 minutes or so around the time of maximal eclipse. But I was watching a bit of the telly as well, and it was very interesting how this experience was conveyed on the television. Because on the one hand, there was a kind of materialist science sort of thread running through the programme. So this was a great opportunity to collect data. This doesn't happen very often. Various phenomena occur around the time of eclipses, and this is a rare chance to gather sort of evidence to try and put together theories. So quite a sort of straightforward kind of evidence-based approach. But of course, this is a great drama, and they were ever more reaching for greater superlatives and adjectives to convey the most wondrous sense of this experience. And you couldn't help but feel that what was going on also was some kind of, the word spiritual experience comes to mind. It got dark, it gets quiet, it's quite eerie. There's something a bit spooky about that. They know what's happening in a materialist sense. It's just that the moon's going across the front of the sun. And yet there's a kind of tangible, almost energetic shift, which even, in the cloudy sky, when it got feeling like it was twilight at about 9:30 in the morning. This has a very powerful sort of bodily impact upon you. And I couldn't help but feel watching this programme that although officially they were following a kind of materialist, this is good for evidence collecting kind of approach, there was something far more profound and subtle going on, which was much more about how the cosmos informs our experience. We kind of behold the cosmos and it speaks to us in a way that's as lively as the life within us that wants to go out and measure these things, you might say.
Yes. No, I agree. I think the fact it's on television at all, and the fact that people are interested in it at all, is not because they're going to be very interested in the scientific data about the temperature of the corona of the sun, or or solar flares and all that kind of thing. Because when the data is published in Nature and Journal of Astronomy and that kind of thing, I mean, virtually nobody's going to read it. So that's not really what it's about. It's about this primal drama and the feeling we have of the way that our life on the earth is influenced by the heavens. I mean, it's good that we understand it and that the science is important, and it's impressive that we can predict eclipses and all that kind of thing. But that's certainly not why people are so engaged and interested.
Yes, that's a good point, because I think that what the science can do is it can provide a way into this more spiritual appreciation of what's going on. You get it's going to happen, and then when it does happen, you have a sense of how our lives depend upon these sort of cosmic bodies, these cosmic forces, which we can predict and can understand to a degree, and yet there seems to be something underneath that which we're connected to them as well.
Yes.
Which I guess, in older worldviews, Dante in the Divine Comedy, looking at the stars and seeing God's intelligence and wisdom and love, manifest in them as much as anything else. There's still something of that going on, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe this atheist experiment, which Nick Spencer charts in his book, it's been an interesting experiment, we might say. I hesitate that slightly because it's been a very bloody experiment too, which the book explores as well.
Well, certainly in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China and in Pol Pot's Cambodia, it's been an extremely bloody experiment, probably the bloodiest experiment that's ever happened in the history of humanity. Yeah.
I mean, that, noting that. But there's a sense in which as things, develop here on, he finishes by saying that there's a nice irony that atheism is likely to remain because God is back, and that there will always be the kind of moral indignation, and rightly so, that should be keeping powerful churches and other religious groups, on their toes. That there's definitely a need for that. You get too identified with God and all sorts of horrors can go wrong as well. But I did like the way that he conveys this sense of, is making man the measure of all things, claiming authority, ultimate authority for ourselves, does it really satisfy? Does it really deliver the society which people hope it might do? And the answer basically is no. And so it would be very interesting to see kind of what happens next.
Exactly, and what he shows is that its history is largely to do with reaction against power structures. It's less to do with the truth of atheism. It's much more as a kind of reactive rhetoric, and take away that which it's reacting to, and its power and influence declines. And I mean, the rise of the new atheism is clearly linked to the rise of the religious right in the US and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. That's really the trigger for the wave of new atheism from 2004 onwards. And as that wave of atheism loses influence, as the atheists fall out with each other and become, it's a less impressive movement than it was. And as the limitations of the materialist view in science become increasingly apparent. I think that it's possible to see atheism as a useful purgative movement. It's a kind of purging fire that can help to act as a critique of religious excess and abuse. But in itself, it's, in a sense, parasitic upon the religious tradition, and being a reaction against it, if it were left to its own devices, would have very little to offer.
So I think that we can recommend to our listeners, for what it's worth, Atheists, The Origin of the Species by Nick Spencer, as a history, but also as a kind of meditation to reflect upon this movement and what it might mean for us and our sense of ourselves.
Yes, and also the way he places it in a historical context and a sociological context. I mean, one of the final points I'd like to make is the way he observes that if you look at atheists today in Europe, firstly, almost all of them are white, and secondly, almost all of them are male. Very few atheists in, other parts of the world, because they're coming from a very different historical and social background. So I think it's a fascinating book, and it illuminated the whole phenomenon for me in a new way.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.